welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Thank you to Zevi Kaufman for his efforts in setting up this episode with Rabbi Walter. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode on the podcast, you can check out the information in the show's notes below, or you can email me svarimchatter@gmail.com. Likewise, if you would like to support the podcast in any way, even less than a sponsorship, you can email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or WhatsApp me if you're on the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community. Also, if you would like to join the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new Svarim, new books, book deals, and those things like that, you can check out the link in the show's notes. Also, if you can subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen, whether on Apple or 24/6, which is terrific, or Spotify, I would appreciate that. And finally, this is the end of season 5. As on Svarim Chatter, I've always done the seasons by Rosh Hashanah. And so we're almost up to episode, season 6 in Rosh Hashanah, which, who would have thought, starting on Periscope back in the day. And thank you to everyone for the continued support. And I hope you'll continue to listen. And I appreciate everyone's feedback. I do try to respond as much as possible. So if you WhatsApp me or email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, I do appreciate that. And this episode, I hope you enjoy this episode about Yomim Nora'im, theme Minhagim, Rosh Hashanah, Tshuva, Yom Kippur, Sukkah, and so on. And with that, I want to wish everyone a Ksiva Chasima Tova, a good gebencht Yar, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Moshe Walter, who is the Rav of the Woodside Synagogue Avas Torah and is the Executive Director of the Rabbinical Council of Greater Washington. And we are going to be discussing Minhagei Yomim Nora'im, a fascinating and subject. Rabbi Walter has written a number of books, including the book that discusses these topics called The Making of a Minhag, The Laws and Parameters of Jewish Customs, published by Feldheim. He's also published 2 other books, one called The Making of a Mensch, The Laws and Parameters of Interpersonal Mitzvos, and one is The Making of a Halachic Decision, The Laws and Parameters of Psak Halacha. So thank you, Rabbi Walter, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your
Let's start off, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So as you said, I've been now in Silver Spring, Greater Washington, for close to 14 years. We moved from Yerushalayim Kodesh, where we spent close to 10 years. And interestingly enough, my sort of introduction to writing, I don't know, you speak to many authors. I don't know if this is conventional or unconventional, what I'll share with you. But I never intended to write a book. I never intended to write 2 books or 3 books, and I'm now working on a 4th book, actually. But toward the end of my time in Kol, I was learning the Mir Yeshiva and other Kol in Yerushalayim, I started jotting down notes and speaking to many people who were asking Shaila sort of how halacha works and basically how we paskin and how psak halacha works, etc., etc., etc. And before I knew it, as I started jotting down a lot of notes, one thing turned to another. One chapter turned to a second chapter turned to a third chapter. And before I knew it, I really had a full chibur, which was the sefer that you just referred to, making a halachic decision. In my first year here in Silver Spring, that book was published. And due to the excitement, we're now in the 3rd printing of that book, it led to many questions regarding minhagim, because I addressed in my first sefer a lot about how halacha works, the parameters of psak halacha, how exactly decisions are made, which svarim are the critical svarim. And therefore, people start asking, well, what's halacha, what's minhag, how does halacha work, how does minhagim work? And that sort of it became the fusion between the making of a halachic decision and then the making of the minhag. The svarim sort of developed from many shurim that I was giving. As I said, I never intended to write a sefer. I was giving shurim in Hilchos Minhagim, in minhag in general. Those listeners who are out there familiar with Mesachas Psachim, there's this little parak called Makom Shenagu. It's the 4th parak in Mesachas Psachim. Nobody knows it, nobody saw it, because if you're learning Psachim, you're learning the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd parak, or the 10th parak, all about Bittul Bir and Arvei Psachim, Leil HaSeder. And if you're learning Kachim, so you're learning Tam Nishchat, and the essence of Kachim is the middle section of Psachim. And then there's these 6 or 7 blot of Makom Shenagu. And as a result of bumping into that parak and giving shurim and Hilchos Minhagim, the sugya in the world of Minhagim was opened up to me. And as a result of the shurim that I was given, I saw that people and the Elul was fascinated by Minhagim and how Minhagim work. And that's really what we're here to talk about today.
People are fascinated by Minhagim. There's so many different Minhagim, and we'll discuss in the beginning some introductory comments. And this is something you do in your book as well about Minhagim in general. You have communal Minhagim, family Minhagim, there's all different types, different minhagim, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, different types of Sephardim, different types of Ashkenazim, whether you're German or Litvish or Hasidish, etc. So there's so much there to discuss. And I had a podcast a few years ago, Rosh Hashanah time, with Rabbi Goldhaber discussing the minhag of covering the shofar, but about the Baltikeh, and that was, there's an article he wrote about this, and he was just saying, and we did a podcast about it, and there was a lot of interest, and I got very good feedback on it. So minhagim is something that fascinates people, and it's interesting. So I think we should start. You mentioned that you got into this in your first book, The Making of Halachic Decision. And so now we get to minhag, and the first thing really to explain for the listeners, I think, is what's the difference between halacha and a minhag? Someone said, this is halacha or this is a minhag? What's the difference?
Maybe I'll give an example. We're holding by Yomim Nora'im, then we'll sort of flesh it out. The Mishnah says in Parak Malkum Shanagu, Malkum Shanagu lahadlik leil menorah or leilos or leil Yom Kippurim malikim, Malkum Shanagu shlo lahadlik ein malikim. There were places where there was a custom to light neiros for Yom Kippur, and there were places that didn't have that minhag. So why were there some places that did, and why were there some places that didn't? We all are familiar, of course, that we do light a neiros Yom Kippurim. So Rashi and other Rishonim explain that the minhag developed as a result of different focuses and approaches that different Rabbanim and different cities had. Everybody had the same idea. There's an Isser of Tashmish Amita Leil Yom Kippurim. So some Rabbanim understood that the way to safeguard that would be by lighting neiros. Other Rabbanim and other cities understood that the way to safeguard that was to make sure that candles were not lit. So therefore, what a minhag really is, it's what Chazal referred to as Minhagei Isser. Minhagim are here to safeguard us from not being over any Isur D'Rabbanan or at times Isur D'Oraisa. So therefore, what a minhag is, it's a decision that Rabbanan make, that cities made, Rishonim made, that the Gemara describes, that the Mishnah certainly articulates certain things that are here to safeguard halachic practice. So different towns, different cities, different constituencies had different focuses. And the minhag that I just described to you, there were different approaches that different cities had to handle that. So therefore, Malkum Shnagu lahadlik malikim, Malkum Shnagu lahadlik ein malikim. Same thing is true at Tisha B'Av. Malkum Shnagu not to do malacha, ein osim malacha. Malkum Shnagu lasos malacha osim. There were different possibilities and approaches. So minhag is very much based upon not a requirement and not what is absolute and not what's uniform. Halacha is absolute. It's must. It's do's, it's don'ts, it's cans, it's can'ts. It's Dalet Chelkei Shulchan Aruch. It's things that all Klal Yisrael are required in. Minhagim are dependent upon the institution of a particular minhag, based upon the Rabbanim of the city, based upon the constituency, based upon the land, based upon what's necessary. And it's for that reason that we see that different cities, different parts of Klal Yisrael, if you're talking about Sephardim versus Ashkenazim, talking about different types of Ashkenazim, have accepted different forms of minhagim, all with this singular focus of trying to make sure and to ensure and to concretize that Dinei D'Rabbanan and Dinei D'Oraisa are kept. That's in a nutshell, I think, the best way to explain
However,
what a minhag is.
However, that does beg the question that when we come to minhag is, how does a minhag become binding? How does something that's a practice become a minhag? So even if we're, even like you're saying, there's different, and that is also, you have a communal minhag, and you have yekis, and you have, again, different, Sephardim and different types of Ashkenazim. Again, there's so many different moving parts, and in Europe you have different towns having different minhagim. So how does that come to be?
So certainly, as you pointed out, there are certain minhagim that are binding, that have teeth and that have perpetuity. There are other minhagim, Chazal referred to as a minhag tos, mistaken minhagim, that sort of crept in or were established or originated. How did that happen, and what's a minhag and what's not a minhag is very much dependent upon whether or not there's a bona fide makor for it. A good example of this is there's a minhag that the Shulchan Aruch quotes that women have a custom not to do work on Rosh Chodesh. There's another minhag that women have a minhag not to do work on Chanukah. But there's a very strong distinction between the two, because the minhag for women not to do work, an avodah, whatever the definition of that is, has a makor, and the Rishonim found makoros for that. They found places and ideas and concepts where that minhag has a basis, and later Rabbanim established that minhag and kept it. And therefore, since it was quoted by later halachic authorities, therefore it's binding, and it's not something that can be uprooted. It could be some places had the minhag, some places didn't have the minhag. But the places that have the minhag create a very strong and long-lasting minhag. However, the minhag not to do work on Chanukah You could try to find a makor. You could work very hard to look and to search and to scour poskim, gedolim, rishonim, and achronim, and gaonim. But if you can't find the source for it, and there's no rabbinic institution, then it's not long-lasting, and it doesn't have a makor. Minhagim very much are often quoted by gaonim, rishonim, and at times the two of the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch will quote minhagim. A lot of Shulchan Aruch will say minhag or nagu, the Ramah especially. But certain minhagim never made it. And those minhagim that didn't make it, sometimes they do have teeth, and sometimes cities will accept it. But at many, many times that will not happen.
In Europe, or back in the day, if you will, the minhagim where you came from a certain town, you came from a certain area, locale, if you will, and there you had to keep these minhagim. However, today everything's all mixed up, and certain people have different minhagim. How does one know what the required minhag of their family, their community is? Is one obligated to keep to a minhag that they have in their family?
It's a very important question. I actually think that this question is what stems people's interest, fascination, and infatuation really with minhagim in general. The truth is, until the mid-1400s and early 1500s, every city, shul, had its own established place. The uniformity that existed in shuls and communities in Klal Yisrael was very clear. Every shul, it was German, it was Hungarian, it was Polish, Sfarad, there was the Iraqis, every single community had its own base. There was no intermarriage between different types of European Jews, and Sephardim married their exact culture and their exact cult, and there was no intermarriage in that respect. People didn't know each other. I don't know if Gedolei Yisrael knew about other great communities in Sfarad and across the countries in Ashkenaz. Therefore, there was never a question of interspersed minhagim. And I know what I did because that's what my mother did, that's what my father did, and that continued. Once Klal Yisrael started to find themselves in Tkufos, where they were starting to mix and starting to find each other in shuls, much of this centered around the Spanish Inquisition, 1492, and the early 1500s, where Klal Yisrael started to become intermingled and living together, that's when we started finding more confusion and lack of uniformity in minhagim and practice. And therefore, many questions regarding los eskodadu, fractions in minhagim, how to practice, what tefillas to say, what tefillas not to say. You start to find in the tshuvas in the early 1500s these questions. And today, as Rabbi Moshe writes in tshuvas, really we have a melting pot society. The world that we live in is a mix. You go to shul, you'll see a German Jew, a Hungarian Jew, a Polish Jew, and Sephardim in all different types. So therefore, what your minhag is, on some level depends on your family minhag, and a certain level it depends upon your shul. And there are many distinctions between family minhagim, shul minhagim, community-wide minhagim, and people need to understand what a minhag is, when a minhag is a minhag that needs to be kept. We don't like tinkering with minhagim, whether it's a minhag of a family, whether it's a minhag of a city. And there are times when a person has to do good research and understand what they do, why they do, and how they do it. It's for that reason that within a 1 block or 2 block radius, you'll have people who are doing enormously different things, and that never existed in the past.
Yeah, you even have husband and wife can have different minhagim. Now, usually the wife will take on the husband's minhagim, but technically they have different minhagim.
So that's a great example of a very new shaila. As far as I'm aware, not till the 1970s or 1980s was that question even addressed. Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva about that. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has a tshuva about that. But till the Gedolei Aposkim of the last generation, that was never a question, because we didn't really find that so much, that Sephardim were marrying Ashkenazim and the like. So when there's questions of what a husband and wife should do, or what should a wife do when she davens nusach Sfarad and she marries a man who davens nusach Ashkenaz, does she have to switch her nusach hatfilah? Or a Sephardi man that marries an Ashkenazi woman, or Ashkenazi woman marries a Sephardi man, what does she do about Pesach and Good Brachs? And what does she do about all different variety of different things, kitnius and the like? Those are new questions, and many of the issues that we're addressing in the world of minhagim, and again, the interest in the world of minhagim today, very much stems from the fact that we are living together, and we don't have that clear makor and our origination that is not as solid and not as based, and therefore that leads to many questions regarding what I should do. Should I do this? Should I not do this? What's my minhag? How do I understand my background? What do I do when I'm in a different place?
It happens to, you mentioned Sephardim, Ashkenazim, it happens even just Ashkenazim. Someone does, the wife does gebrok, the husband doesn't brok, even this happens, all the time now. So when someone has a minhag, the family minhag, but then they don't want to do it, or whatever the case is, do they need to do Hataras Nedarim to now not do this minhag anymore?
Yeah, so Hataras Nedarim is an option, but in order to do Hataras Nedarim, a person has to know that they have the opportunity to do Hataras Nedarim. Speak about this in the Sefer, and of course it's a major sugya, it's a chas, and it's a major topic when you can and can't do Hataras Nedarim. Yes, there are times when Hataras Nedarim is permitted. Of course, you need a Pesach, you need a opportunity and a reason to be able to do that. We don't like to do Hataras Nedarim. It's not something we like doing. Of course, as we're coming on to the Yomim Nora'im, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we're very busy with Hataras Nedarim, Erev Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Kol Nidrei, and the like. We could talk about that. But when there is a reason to be matir neder, we can. One of the areas that we don't allow Hataras Nedarim, and this is important for people to be aware of, if there's a citywide minhag, it can't just be matir neder. If there's a minhag, a ha'ir, there's a minhag of Ashkenaz. Take, for example, a good example of this would probably be Kitnius. You can't be matir neder in Kitnius, the famous Chuvas, the Chacham Tzvi and Rabbi Yaakov Emden and others, until when Klal Yisrael, at least in Ashkenaz, as opposed to Sfarad, accepted not to eat Kitnius on Pesach, that was a acceptance of Ashkenaz. And in order to be mevatel that, you need all of Chachmei Ashkenaz to be mevatel that minhag. That's how minhagim work. So I, as an Ashkenazi Jew, can't just be matir neder on eating kidneys. We need Klal Yisrael to be matir neder on that in order to uproot the minhag. That's what Rabbi Yaakov Emden famously writes in Mor K'tzia, that Lule, were I to find all of Gedolei Yisrael and Ashkenaz to be able to uproot the minhag, then I would do it. But clearly, that wasn't feasible for Rabbi Yaakov Emden. That's not feasible for any Gedolei Yisrael to do out of Yom Hazeh. So therefore, yes, when there is a minhag that requires, necessitates, and there's a good reason for it, then there's the possibility of being matir neder. However, there are certain things that we either will not permit Hataras Nedarim for, or that implicitly a Hataras Nedarim does not work for. So when you can be matir neder, when you can't be matir is a big sugya, and we have to know and have to learn that sugya to know and appreciate when you can and cannot do that. Of course, the Gemara says, Chazal explained that minhagim are be'etzem and neder. That's what a minhag is. So the same way you can't just uproot a neder, you can't uproot a minhag. Minhagim have significance to them. Minhag is Shal Torah, minhag of Sem B'Yadeinu. They're important, and thus, as a result, to simply abolish a minhag is not something that we do lightly, can take lightly, and we take that very seriously.
Okay, so now let's turn to the title of the podcast, which is Minhagei Yomim Nora'im. And so let's start with L'Dovid Hashem Ayri. Professor Shneur Lyman has on this famously. Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brat did, I believe, a two-part series on this on Old Daf last year. But L'Dovid Hashem Ayri, why do we say it? Where does that minhag come from?
Well, L'Dovid Hashem Ayri has received a lot of interest over the last decade or so. A lot of people are very curious about it. The truth is, we say it, upwards of 30 times a year, twice a day. So we're talking about saying L'Dovid about 100 times. So when it became part of the Siddur and when it was instituted to the Siddur is subject to a lot of controversy, a lot of things that we don't fully appreciate and understand. It seems that based upon the basic, most credible information that we have, there's a very fascinating sefer called the Chemdas Hayamim. Chemdas Hayamim is a sefer be'etzem of Kabbalah. The complication with it is that its authorship is not very clear. And this sort of leads to a very clear division amongst those who are supporters and those who are opponents of the recitation of L'Dovid. Chemdas Hayamim, according to some, and there's many sources for this, you'll see in my sefer, could be has origins in Talmidei of Shabsai Tzvi. However, others think that that's not the case at all. So therefore, those who are opposed to its recitation, and you could see many Hasidim actually were quite opposed to the Divrei Chaim, the Rebbe of Tzanz, the Chazim Lublin, the Yiddish Kaddish. These are all a number of Gedolei Chasidus who were very, very opposed to its recitation. Others, for example, the Gra was a strong opponent of it. The Gra and Talmidei Gra and Mesiras writes that the Vilna Gaon did not recite L'Dovid. The reason that he didn't recite L'Dovid is not clear. I will mention B'Maimar Muskar. Many people talk about Nusach HaGra. The Nusach HaGra is something that's very unclear. The Gra never wrote a Nusach. The Gra never wrote a Siddur. We have something called Sidurim of the Gra. Those were written by later Talmidim, but not even as a siddur. What we know about what the Gra said and didn't say in Tefillah is based basically on his pithy comments in Bir HaGra. It's based upon what his Talmidim said in Ma'aseh. But in Ma'aseh it says that the Gra never recited L'Dovid Hashem. They don't explain why. Later Talmidim explain either one of two reasons, either because it was a tircha de tzibura, or because the Vilna Gaon was very opposed to adding anything to the siddur. So we have Hasidim, many Hasidim, I can't say across the board, the different sects, of course, but many of the Gedolei Hasidus were very opposed to its recitation, and the Gedolei Ashkenaz, including the Vilna Gaon, was very opposed. So why is it that we say it? So it's a very, very important sefer. And if we're talking about Svarim Chatter, your wonderful podcast, and we're talking about the Minhagim, the Yomim Nora'im, there's a sefer that's a must, that everybody has to be familiar with, and that's, of course, the Mateh Ephraim. The Mateh Ephraim, written by Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margolius, I believe it was written in 1834, if I'm not mistaken, is a classic work, which has been quoted by the Gedolei Aposkim since it was printed in 1834, the Mishnah Berurah, and many, many others cite the Mateh Ephraim as sort of like the Posek Achron in all issues regarding Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkah. And the Mateh Ephraim quotes the minhag to recite L'Dovid Hashem. And my sense and my opinion is that the acceptance of L'Dovid in the non-Hasidic world and the non-Talmidei Hagra world most probably developed as a result of the fact that the Mateh Ephraim, who is extraordinarily authoritative source, puts it down as something to do. And therefore, that's the reason that most of Ashkenaz is reciting L'Dovid Hashem. But I will point out, as I did, the Gra did not, and the major Hasidish Rabbanim, Poskim, Gedolim did not. I believe also the Ben Ish Chai and many Sephardic sects do not recite L'Dovid Hashem. But by us, by Ashkenaz, and certainly in yeshivas, the fact that it was recited certainly brought it into our fold. And there's no question that if you think about Elul, one of the things that we think about is Tkiyah Shofar, the minhag of Tkiyah Shofar, the minhag of the recitation of L'Dovid. So L'Dovid actually is a very, very good example of minhagim and what is said and what's not said. And it's an example of something that there's no shas about it. The Rishonim don't talk about it, and there's no Torah, there's no Beis Yosef, there's no Shulchan Aruch, there's no Magen Avraham, there's no Tas, and therefore, as a result, we see many different ways to approach it. The Gra takes the approach that there's no Shas, there's no Dina de Gemara, so it shouldn't be recited. If anything, it's a Tircha de Tzibura. On the other hand, the Mateh Ephraim says it's a nice custom, it's an important custom, and it seems to indicate the importance of Ori, Yishi, Rosh Hashanah, Yom HaKippurim, Kibbutz Sukkah, Yatzpineni. It's preparing us for the Yom Tiv and the Yomim Nora'im of Tishrei. So therefore, it gets us in the mood, and that's another thing that minhagim do. Minhagim are supposed to bring out a certain emotional response. They're supposed to bring out a certain feel and gefeel for the Yom Tiv, and therefore, that's what we see, the tension that lies in its position and in its recitation.
And if anyone wants to know more about L'Dovid, again, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brot has I think it's 2-part on Old Daf. You should check that out. Fantastic. And then, so, he points out, I think, maybe there's some Sfarim that have it that predate Chemdes Yomim, Rabbi Yaakov, and others accuse it of being Sabbatian. There's also an article from Rabbi Chiel Goldhaber in the Sefer Zakaron for Professor Meir Ben-Yo, where he talks about, in general, who the author was of Chemdes Yomim. He talks about the Hasidim don't say it because it's Sabbatian, L'Dovid, etc. But even L'Dovid, even those that do say it, when do you start saying, when do you end saying it? Do you say it by Shachris, by Mincha, by Ma'ariv? So there's lots of different opinions on that. Okay, turning to another minhag, which is something that you discussed as well, is the weddings during Elul and Hataras Me'etshuva.
That's also another fascinating case study of minhagim, really. We're familiar, the Gemara tells us that there's no marriages that take place on Shabbos and Yom Tov Chol Moed. That we know. That's clear. That's writ large in text, Mishnayos, Gemara, Shabbos and Yom Tov, because of Gezer Shem Yichtov, it's a kinyan. Chol Moed ein marvin simcha b'simcha. So those are clear. Chazal later found other dates on the calendar where we don't marry. The 3 weeks for Ashkenaz, for Sfardim, it's Shavur Shechalbo, maybe ready from Tisha B'Av, from the beginning of the 9 days, Rosh Chodesh Av, and the same thing by Sfiras Omer. So where is the possibility of there being an issue getting married during the Seres Yimei Tshuva or during Elul? So if you take a look again, it's the Mateh Ephraim. The Mateh Ephraim, Lanius Daiti, seems to be the Makor that puts this down. And the Mateh Ephraim writes that the minhag is not to marry during the Seres Yimei Tshuva. The problem is, the Mateh Ephraim doesn't explain anything. And he doesn't tell us why, what the source is, what the Makor is, and what the basis of this is altogether. Interesting enough, in Shulchan Aruch, Shlomo Kuger brings several suggestions as to why, as does the Stei Chemed. And basically what they're pointing out is that these are serious times. These are times of introspection. They're times of Emas Hadin. And just like there's no marriages during the 3 weeks or during Sfiras Omer, which are times of avelus, times of seriousness, times in the calendar where we have a more of a focused approach, a serious approach, maybe the reason why the Sdei Chemet suggests is as a result of the fact that these are serious days, intense days, and thus that became the basis, at least as to why B'Shalom McCluger and why the Mat Ephraim Zalman Megaris understood that we don't. Now, what's interesting here, as opposed to L'Dovid, is this minhag of the Mat Ephraim is not brought by the Kaf HaChaim, it's not brought by the Chai Adam, it's not brought by the Aruch HaShulchan, and it's not brought by the Mishnah Berurah. So here you see a very, very important distinction minhagim. As opposed to L'Dovid, which the Mat Ephraim puts down and was picked up by the Gedolei Achronim, here this minhag wasn't penned and wasn't codified for posterity by the Gedolei Aposkim. I can't say all, because the kids are Shulchan Aruch, and the Siddur of the Beis Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Emden does bring it. And therefore, as a result, we see many, many different approaches in how to handle this. David Tzvi Hoffman, the great German Rav, the author of the Sefer Melamed Lahol, classic Tshuva Sefer, writes that he himself got married during the Aseres Yemei Tshuva. His father was one of the Gedolei Germany, and other Gedolim of Germany were there, and they didn't say a word. So he takes the position that absolutely you can't get married during the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, and more than that, it's a mitzvah. Why not rack up all the mitzvahs that we can in the new year? Sdei Chemet writes the same thing, that he once officiated a wedding. He was the Rav in Hebron, and there were those who opposed that he was being Mesader Kiddushin. However, the Sdei Chemet began to research and look and to find, and he saw that Taka in the Sefer the Mat Ephraim, it has this statement that one shouldn't get married, and therefore he sort of hemmed and hawed and was more hesitant as to whether a wedding should be performed. So when it comes to a second marriage, or a tzorech, or a shas hatchak, absolutely positively it can. So here you see very, very interestingly how we approach a minhag. It's not Dina de Gemara, it's not absolute, it's not certainly mutter, it's not certainly usr. Now, of course, Medina de Gemara and Mishnah and Gemara, there's no isser, but nonetheless, as a result of the Mat Ephraim statement and those achronim who try to express and articulate reasons as to why one shouldn't marry, it was taken more seriously. But on the other hand, there were those who didn't take it seriously, and it wasn't penned. So therefore, that's the tension that exists regarding weddings during the Aseres Yemei Tshuva. On the other hand, Elul, we find no makor. And Rabbi writes this clearly in a tshuva, and this is a good example you asked me before, minhag toast. It's a mistaken minhag. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist. Who made this up? Where does it come from? Who imagined this? Who dreamed it up? And therefore, this would be a mistake. This would be wrong. And I think there are many Gedolei Yisrael who married during that time period, many who are Mesader Kiddushin during that time period, and therefore, there's no reason, there's no basis at all, and this is a minhag that would be a mistaken minhag, an inappropriate minhag. And adarabba, if there's a reason to marry, you should marry, and it's a good time to marry, it's the right thing to do.
Now we'll move on to some minhagim that are very famous, which is the Simanim, Rosh Hashanah night. The Gemara talks about it. But even then, there's different Simanim, different fruits and vegetables and different things. It's both nights, Techiano fruit. So let's talk about Rosh Hashanah night.
So Rosh Hashanah night is a very fascinating night, of course, and Simanim, as the Gemara says in Harius Ukrisus, Simanim Milsa. We take Simanim seriously. I'll point out to you one of the reasons which is probably less known as to why Simanim are something that we take seriously. Why is Tapuach B'Dvash and the Karsi and the Rimon, what's this all about? It seems almost, not such a Jewish thing to do. So the Chai Adam quotes a Ramban, the Ramban al Torah, who writes that any time a prophecy, a nevuah takes place, in Nevi'im or Ksuvim, it happens at the beginning with a maisa, an action takes place, in order to concretize the nevuah. And in order for anything to be real and anything significant to happen, and for a prophecy to take place, or anything of great import to actually fall and to have a place in Olam Haza, it needs a maisa. And therefore the Chayadim, quoting the Ramban, explains that that's actually the pshat in the minhag of Simanim on Leil Rosh Hashanah. In order to bring down the Shefa, to bring down the Midas Hadin, and to turn it into Rachamim throughout the Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah, and this is not Sifrei Kabbalah, this seems to be the Ramban saying Al Pi Pshat and not Al Pi Sod, we need to do something. So therefore, by eating something and by taking the Tapuach B'Dvash, taking those items that the Gemara refers to, that creates a reality, it concretizes what we want to take place on Rosh Hashanah. I'll also point out similarly, it's interesting to note, you talk about food, we love food as Jews, Simanim on Rosh Hashanah is not the only time we focus on food. If you take a look, I believe, in almost every Ramah throughout the Yomim Tovim, the Ramah points out that there's a minhag Ashkenaz to have different types of foods. Rosh Hashanah, of course, the Ramah writes tapuach b'dvash. Erev Yom Kippur, of course, there's a mitzvah saseh d'oraisa to eat. When it comes to Chanukah, the Ramah pens and says that there's a minute to eat gvina, to eat forms of milchik types of food, because Yehud is probably slayed Eli Purnis by getting him drunk, by giving him milk. And the same thing's true when it comes to Pesach. Pesach, there's a minhag that Ramah writes, they should have a beitza before Shulchan Aruch. Shavuos, we have machalik kolav. Purim, we have Michael Zeronim. That's what Daniel ate in Bavel. So food plays a significant role in Minhag Yisrael. I'm not only talking about sufganiot, and I'm talking about having, halapchis and Hoshana Rabbah, but when it comes to foods, the Ramah understood that those are minhagim that are significant. So much so that part of the nature of a Yom Tov, and of course this is not minhag Yisr, but a minhag brings out a certain element of the Yom Tov. So the tapuach and dvash, the way the Chai Adam explains from the Ramban, and as the Ramah also says that there's a minhag not to eat egos, not to eat certain types of nuts, because it's gematria chet. We eat fatty meat, like the Psukim say in Nehemiah, l'chu echel mashmanim shesumam takim leinachon. So therefore, the eating, the what we're doing when we are eating, when we're drinking, and the foods that we eat have significance to them. The Ramah says there's a minhag not to sleep on Rosh Hashanah. The Gaon writes that Mishnah Berurah brings, you shouldn't get angry on Rosh Hashanah. Everything that we do in Rosh Hashanah is sort of laden with significant spiritual potency. And it's sort of the germination of the beginning of the new year. It's the embryo is building, it's developing. And therefore, the things that we do have significance, import to them. And therefore, the same is true when it comes to the foods that we eat. One of the interesting things regarding Simanim, which lately has become more of a conversation, and the truth is it's an old discussion. You can even find in the Rishonim, the Aguda talks about this, the Tur talks about this. Is the list that the Gemara has in Krisis and Harios exhaustive? When the Gemara says that you could have Tamri and Rubia, so can I make up other simanim? Many people famously, they want to have other types of interesting simanim. They'll eat life cereal because it's life, raisin salary because you'll have raisin and salary, you have a raisin. What's that all about? So the Aguda actually writes, and the Torah explains that if the purpose of simanim actually is not the food, but it's what the food represents and what you're saying, sheyichrasu sonenu, sheyirbu zuchiyosenu, shana tova mesuka. So there would be an argument that the list is not exhaustive. And therefore, here's another good example where a minhag develops even further and beyond what it says in Shas and the Rishonim. If you understand and appreciate the yesod of the minhag and the nugget and the kernel as to why Chazal, why the Rishonim, the Gaonim, and Achronim fleshed out the minhag, then there is the possibility that the minhag may even play itself out in more significant ways as well.
Right, and even then you have people, some do the simanim also on the second night, some on the first night. Shechiona fruit, as we mentioned, that's a separate thing.
So it's another good point that you make, which is that minhagim created halacha. If you look in the Achronim, you'll see the Kaf HaChaim and Gdolei Achronim have a discussion. So what should you have first? Should you have the Tamar first or the Eitz first? And that gets into a Shaila. Do you have Chaviv first or do you have what's Adif first? So you get into significant questions that begin to touch on the Minutia Halacha as a result of Minhagim. And therefore, Minhag Yisrael Torah, who means that it developed halachic conversation, dialogue, and discussion as to what should happen, how do you do it. And the poskim are even medayik in the Gemara. The Gemara says in one place in Krisis that you should eat the simanim, and another place Shas says that you should simply look at the siman. And therefore, many questions about the simanim, and it's a fascinating area that has caught the attention of our door. And it's interesting, I don't know about you, but growing up, simanim wasn't something that was terribly popular or common. By the Sfardim, they had simanim. But here's another example where, as a result of the melting pot society that we live in, and certainly with more people living in Eretz Yisrael, being educated and trained in yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, when you see that the Sfardim doing their tables Rosh Hashanah, it crept in amongst the Ashkenazim. I think when we were growing up, you had the tapuach b'dvash. But today you wouldn't be caught dead just having a tapuach b'dvash if you don't have every other siman. So this is another example of how minhagim develop. It's not required. If you don't have any simanim, you didn't do anything wrong. You're still a good yid. But if one wants to add simanim to their table, so by all means, kol hakavod, there's no problem with that. That might also have to do with
now being the schooler generation. But anyways.
No question about that. That should be for a different
Absolutely.
podcast.
So now we're
we can
going
talk
in
about
order, but I realized we went a little out of order because we really forgot about Erev Rosh Hashanah. When Erev Rosh Hashanah, we have Hataras and Nedarim and the Mesiras Moda'ah, and even the Mesiras Moda'ah, some people do Erev Rosh Hashanah, some people do Erev Yom Kippur. We could talk about that, but let's talk about those two things. Those are something that.
Yeah, Minhagei Rosh Hashanah also, there's no end. But one of the areas that you find significant discussion, and this really there's serious Gemaras and Nedarim, and the Rishonim talk about, is there a requirement to be matir neder prior to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? Is a question, dafka when and at what point? And significantly, if we have time to talk about Kol Nidrei, creates a very significant question which the Rishonim debate. Why are we citing Kol Nidrei if you're already matir neder of Rosh Hashanah? Or pum fakert, if you're going to be matir neder erev Rosh Hashanah, so what's the need and the necessity for Kol Nidrei? And moreover, if you're Mesira Moda'ah, and if you say that all Nedarim that I'm going to state year by year by year are meaningless and are null and void and are lo shrin v'lo kayamin, so then what's the reason for Hataras Nedarim altogether? So this is a very important issue. I discuss this at great length in several chapters in the book. But we see and we find that actually there is no makor in all of Shas for Kol Nidrei. And I think everybody would say that if there's anything that speaks to the essence of what Yom Kippur is, it's the haunting niggin of Kol Nidrei, which, by the way, I'll point out that both the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch as well as the Mat Ephraim write that the niggin of Kol Nidrei is the niggin hayadua. Hopefully we'll have time to talk about changing nigunim and what nigunim we keep and don't keep. But the haunting tune of Kol Nidrei is a relatively recent addition. There's discussion when that was instituted. Arguably, Kol Nidrei was instituted in the beginning at the times of Spain and the Marranos. The Marranos, after they were involved in their somewhat elusive conversion to Christianity, came every year on Leil Kol Nidrei and would feel bad and would say that everything that they did, they didn't mean, they didn't want to do. It wasn't something that they were really meant and wanted to do. So therefore, the significance of what we say, how we say it, and when we say it, certainly speaks to the fact that prior to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we want to make sure that we're not holding on to anything that we weren't supposed to say or weren't supposed to do. So the Mesiras Moda'ah is really the second half of the Hataras Nedarim. And what's most interesting really about the Mesiras Moda'ah, which people are unaware of or confused about, is it's something entirely different than Hataras Nedarim. Every Erev Rosh Hashanah, really we're doing two things. Number one, we're being matir neder for things that we did in the past. And number two, we're being Mesira Moda'ah that any neder that I make in the future really does not have any weight or doesn't carry any teeth to it. It does seem to be potentially contradictory, because if I made the Hodah and Moshe the Moda'ah, then what do I have to be matir neder for anything for? Shlomo Zalman has an arichas about this, a tshuva mincha Shlomo about this, and really the Rishonim talk about this. But at the end of the day, the purpose of Hataras Nedarim is in order to ensure that we are not carrying any neder, any vow that we made inappropriately and wrong. And the very strong Minhag Yisrael for many generations, although you do not find any statement, not in the Tur, not in the Beis Yosef, not in the Shulchan Aruch, that clearly and explicitly states that one must be matir neder. Nonetheless, this has clearly become the custom, as is written by the Mishnah Berurah, the Mat Ephraim, and others, that it's something that we do, it's something that we arguably do. Many discussions regarding, should I do it on behalf of my wife? Does a woman need Hataras Nedarim? How the Bezdin for Hataras Nedarim works? All of these questions, again, are another good example of the halacha that was developed and emerged as a result of this minhag. And here's another very important point, which is that this is a very critical minhag which picked up popularity. And there's almost nobody who will go into Rosh Hashanah, certainly not into Erev Yom Kippur, not being matir neder. But I was Mesir Moda'ah the year before, and there's no Gemara, and you're going to even do say Kol Nidrei on Leil Yom Kippur. But Klal Yisrael, in its resilience and in its significance and sincerity to make sure to be medaktek on everything that we do this season, Hataras Nedarim became one of those areas and a banner for Minhagei
And even
Yisrael
the
of
text of
Chodesh
Kol
Tishrei.
Nidrei, some say for future vows and some don't say that in the text of Kol Nidrei. So you have 2 chapters in the book discussing Hataras Nedarim. Kol Nidrei, this is something you discuss extensively.
Yeah, Kol Nidrei and that which you just referred to, whether Kol Nidrei is the past, the future, is Machlokas Rishon, Machlokas Rebbeinu Tam, and the Rosh. And if you take a look in your Siddur, all the listeners will be interested to find out, if you take a look at different Sidurim and different Machzorim, you will probably find different texts as to what exactly is said at Kol Nidrei. And this again speaks to the development of Minhagim. And if you take a look at the different Sidurim today, they're really paskening on this Shaila. And the Shaila has sort of been nifshat that we do both. We paskin both like Rabbeinu Tam and like the Rosh, that we're matir neder for the previous year's Nedarim, and we're also matir neder for the future Nedarim which take place. And here we find a very, very significant machlokas rishonim, and the impact of it is significant in terms of what exactly is being said. You could have a chazan who says one thing at a shul who's confused and doesn't know what to say. You could have a sitter that says something else. And all this goes back to major machlokas gaonim, major machlokas rishonim. The truth is, Kol Nidrei itself was fraught with controversy. If you take a look at my chapter on Kol Nidrei, it wasn't fully accepted. Many gedolei gaonim and Rishon were very opposed to it, because the fact that how could it be that you're just making light of Nedarim based upon the statement that Rava makes in Mesechus Nedarim? Everybody could just be matir neder every single year, and there's a tune and there's a niggin, and everybody is doing it. So I'll be making Nedarim all year, and they won't have such value or significance or impact because I know I can be matir neder, and therefore many gedolei gaonim and Rishonim were significantly opposed to it. Of course, the Shulchan Aruch writes based upon the Tur that this is the minhag and this is what we do. So within the world of Kol Nidrei, there are 2 major machloksim that we're relying upon, and that is whether to say Kol Nidrei or not to say Kol Nidrei, and even if you do so Kol Nidrei, are you saying it based upon being matir neder the past or the future? So we take for granted that we are using machzorim and sidurim, but at the end of the day, there are major questions as to whether or not Kol Nidrei is recited. But of course, as is clearly the case throughout Sfarad and Ashkenaz, the recitation of Kol Nidrei has become par for the course in any Beis HaKnesses and Beis Medrash for hundreds and even close to 1,000 years.
Something that you don't discuss in the book, is just worth discussing a little bit, is Kaparis, which is, if you go back, today everyone does, we go back in time to the Rishayim, and you look in the first print of Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Karo says Minhag Shtutzu, so this is an interesting minhag.
So Kaparis is actually another great example where you find the tension between minhag and halacha. And I discussed this many times in the book, and it's fascinating. There are many minhagim that we have that are questionable al pi halacha. And this is really one of those, so much so that it could be that doing Kaparis, like the Gonim said, is considered to be darchei amori. So on the one hand, you're talking about an Isser and Lav Diraisa, and on the other hand, it's a Minhag Kadosh. So this is a Machlokas Gonim, as the Shulchan Aruch points out, Machlokas the Mechaber and the Ramah. Today is in the Mechaber. Should we not? And there are many examples, and much of what I talk about in the book is how to deal and how to Rishonim, how to Achron, and how to Poskim deal with when a Minhag faces off with a Halacha. If there's time, we could talk about it, but not only when it comes to Kaparis, when it comes to Sukkah, for example, is a wonderful example of this. There's a mitzvah, there's a chiyuv, mandatory to sleep in the Sukkah. But the Ramah writes the minhag is that we don't sleep in the Sukkah. We don't sleep in the Sukkah? What do you mean? The Pasuk says that you should be in the Sukkah for Shivas Yamin. And that's a clear halach and Siman Tov Reish Lamed Tes. So what is the Ramah teaching when he says that we don't sleep in the Sukkah? The minhag is not to sleep in the Sukkah. So we could talk about that and try to understand and grapple with what happens when halacha says one thing and the minhag says something else. And this is a great example. Kaparis is an example of that. Yeshiva Sukkah is an example of that. When it comes to Purim, there are examples of that. Shaking the Gragar, Mitzad Echad is a very strong minhag that the Ramah writes, but Mitzad Sheni, you can't hear the Baal Kriya. So you're being mevatel the mitzvah, the Rabbanon of Kriyas HaMegillah. So any time that there is a debate and a discrepancy and sort of a pulling of the threads of 2 ends when it comes to minhag and halacha, it's fascinating to see how poskim, the Rishonim, Gedolei Achronim address that type of question, and Kaparis is just that. And it's for that reason that some have a very strong position that Kaparis is critical and that it's mandatory, it's a must, it's an ancient minhag of the Gonim. And there are those who take a very strong position that it's not what should be done. So this minhag was debated 1,000 years ago, the minhag is sort of settled, and those who do, those who don't, and it's expressed and articulated and codified certainly by the Mechaber and the Ramah, and those who have the minhag are doing it for the reason that they do it, and those who have the minhag not to do it are not doing it for that very reason.
That, to be clear, the Ramah obviously says you should do kaparis, and this is settled. The Ramban said it was Darkei Mori. The Rashba didn't like it. And when I said minhag shel shtus, by the way, this is the first edition of Shulchan Aruch. The title, the heading of the Siman was minhag shel shtus. But that's since been changed. It's been taken out. It doesn't say it anymore if you look in Shulchan Aruch now. That actually was removed. Rizv Carroll wrote it that way. Anyways, you mentioned changing tunes. Many different tunes are used for Yomim Nora'im, depending where you daven and your nusach. What about changing the tune? What even is the standard tune to change it?
Good question. So this is actually a very important Ramah, quoting the Mariel. Rabbi Yaakov Milon was the foundation to a certain extent of Minhag Ashkenaz. The Ramah regularly quotes the Mahariel. The Mahariel writes, and this is codified by the Ramah, the following story: that the Mahariel was traveling and he found himself in Regensburg. And because Rabbeinu Ephraim was from the city of Regensburg, he thought it would be important to recite a piyut as the Shliach Tzibur, the visiting Shliach Tzibur in the city of Regensburg, to include a piyut of Rabbeinu Ephraim while he was in the city of Regensburg. The Tzibur wasn't terribly excited about that. There was a bit of a debate, should he not? And the Mariel decided that indeed he would include and add the piyut of Rabbeinu Ephraim for the year that he found himself in Regensburg. At a later date, the Mariel doesn't say exactly when, the daughter of the Mariel died on Yom Kippur. And the Mahariel writes in no uncertain terms that he has a very strong indication that the reason for the death of his daughter on Yom Kippur was as a result of him changing the niggin of the city. And the Ramah writes and posits and codifies that it's inappropriate, it's wrong to change a minhag, to change a niggin. And therefore, that is the reason and the basis why a tune, a niggin, a song that a shul has, that a community has, that a town has, and even that a family has significant weight to it. Sefer Chasidim, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid similarly writes, like the Mahariel, that he was aware of somebody who changed a tune, who changed a niggin, and within 30 days this individual passed away. Why is it so significant, and why can't you change a niggin? So the Sefer Chasidim, Yehuda Chassid writes, because that's exactly what a minhag is. You can't change a minhag. It's lo sasig gvul rishonim. It's an issur d'oraisa. The Rambam writes, not regarding nigunim or minhag specifically, but the Rambam writes that minhagim are bechlal lo sasur, just like you can't change a d'oraisa, the Rabbanan. The same thing is true when it comes to minhagim. And therefore the Sefer Chasidim says that once a tune exists, to change it is being masig gvul rishonim. The Magen Avraham has a different explanation. The Magen Avraham says the reason why we can't change Nigunim is because it's going to confuse the congregation. It's going to confuse people. Yomim Nora'im, the tefillos are significant. They're important. People don't recite the tefillos of the Yomim Nora'im as regularly, and therefore if you change a tune, you change the nigun, it's going to throw people off the congregation off. So therefore, what emerges is that tunes are important, nigunim are important, piyutim are important, and simply tinkering and changing with nigunim is not something that should be done. That's what I referred to earlier. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the Matafram, write regarding Kol Nidrei. And I'm not sure if there's any other tune to Kol Nidrei. Everybody knows the nigun for Kol Nidrei, as the Matafram writes, hanigin hayadua, the known tune. Not something you could change, not something you could tinker with. A nafkamina might be whether or not you could teach new nigunim to your shul in advance, to your community in advance. Could you switch out a nigun if there's a tune that's not very inspiring, it's not working for the congregation? Kaf HaChaim addresses that, and it indicates that that would be mutter. But certainly what one must appreciate as a result of the story of the Mariel and the Rebbe Chassid, and now which the Rama codifies for posterity, that here you have a wonderful example that even a nigun is not something that you could change, not something that you could simply abuse and to tinker with. Now, of course, introducing a new tune for V'chol Ma'aminim or a new tune for Hayom, that I don't believe there's any long-term standing minhag. But if there's a shul that has a tune for that particular song, so that's not something that should be changed. But certainly many of the classic tunes and the nusach that exists and many there's a Telz niggin, there's a Mir niggin, there's a Polish niggin, there's a German. Those are significant. You go to that shul, that's what you expect, that's what you want to hear. And those existed for hundreds of years, and that's not something that anybody wants to change, should change. And if you do change it, all the Mariel tells us what's going to result.
But what's so interesting today, how it differs, is that, living in Lakewood, especially the greater Lakewood area, there's new shuls, basement shuls, house shuls popping up. There's new neighborhoods pop up all the time. So a lot of shuls, it's not like what you had, back in the day you had this, or even some other communities. Again, I'm speaking from Lakewood. We have established shuls for decades or generations where they have a certain way of doing things. It's not always like that. Like you're saying, some places get together and the Baal Shachris davens one nusach and the Baal Musaf was used to davening tells a nusach, and then suddenly they're establishing the minhag that way. They're singing this song, they're singing that. So, it's kind of moving around. It's kind of what we have today in America with minhagim. It's not exactly what it was. It's different.
Find one shul they'll have a nusach Ashkenaz for Shabbos and nusach Sfard or Sfard for Musaf. Is that okay? Is that not okay? Somebody recently asked me that question. Rabbi Yaakov Kamnetsky famously said, "A shul without a rav is like a bor b'shus rabbim." So I'll leave that the small shuls in Lakewood should make sure that they have somebody who's appropriate, who knows how to handle those shilas. But yes, nigunim are important, minhag is important, nusach is important, nigunim are important, seder hatfila is important. These are things that are the Mesiras of Klal Yisrael. If I can for a minute, I'll share with you one of the haskamas to the book, which I think is important for people to be familiar with. I'm sorry, I'm not intending to toot my own horn, but Shlomo Miller writes something that I think is, once you're asking, he says, "B'meshech hadoros hayakiyum haMesoras b'Klal Yisrael alidei diktuk haminhagim." Exactly your point, that for generations, really, the Mesorah was kept through meticulousness, precision in minhagim. Ukehayom nisrashel inyan zeh shel Mesoras haminhag. Mahaytayim bekam advarim kol echad osek Moshe rotzeh. And this really, Rabbi Shlomo Miller, amongst other Gedolei Rabbanim in this generation, were very passionate about the Sefer because minhagim are critical. They keep the continuity, the perpetuity of who we are, what we mean, what we established. And therefore, as a result, like you pointed out, simply opening up a shul without any basis, background, and not taking seriously what the minhag is or what the minhag should be, or consulting with others or other rabbanim or other shuls in the neighborhood. So it used to be that's what was done. There was the big shul, there was the smaller shuls, and everybody was more or less trying to keep within some sort of Mesorah. But these are critical points and important points, and certainly something to take into account.
Yeah, I'm not saying that these shuls do it, on purpose. They're not trying to do anything different. It's just what nusach should it be? You put up a Baal Tefillah, and the guy learned in Telz, or a place that has a Telz and nusach. Someone else learned another yeshiva nusach. That's just how it comes out. They're not trying to intentionally do anything. It's just a new shul. There's no established set. We follow this mahalach. That's all. So something else that that's worth discussing as we moved into Sukkahs is sleeping in the Sukkah. Especially sleeping in the Sukkah and Chutz L'Aretz, something, this is again, when you mentioned some of those, we have Halacha, and on the other hand, you have Minhag. So Halacha is one way, Minhag is another way. This is something else.
Yeah, very strong mention, specifically here. Again, as we pointed out, that many times the Minhag and Halacha conflict. This is a perfect example. There's a mitzvah to sleep in the Sukkah. Sleeping in the Sukkah is seriously much more important than eating in the Sukkah, of course, as we know. So therefore, the fact that there are Ramah, it's umash and nohagin. Lo lishan b'sukkah, that which is the custom that we don't sleep in the sukkah in the Chutz L'Aretz, and there must be just two reasons to reconcile that which is not happening. Number one, either because the cold, the tzina, the core, or because there's a halacha of teishu kein taduru, and the way that we sleep all year is ish v'ishto, and if it's not a possibility for ishto to sleep in the sukkah, one's wife can't sleep in the sukkah, so therefore you don't have teishu kein taduru. But it's important to point out, and many gedolei achorim make this point, the Yosef Ometz or Yosef Han, famously of German minhag, the Munkacher Rav points this out in his Nemukei Arachaim. The Ramah is not saying that don't sleep in the sukkah. If you read the Ramah carefully, and I talk more about this in my first say for the making of a halachic decision, the Ramah is trying to defend Klal Yisrael who are not sleeping in the sukkah. The Ramah is not coming out and telling us don't sleep in the sukkah. You can't say that. The halacha is you have to sleep in the sukkah. But people aren't doing it. So why aren't people doing it? The Ramah tells us that there must be a basis and an origin for why they're not doing it. Either it's so cold it's impossible, mitzvahs patur min sukkah, or teishu came to do it. If I don't have my wife sleeping in the sukkah, I can't sleep in the sukkah. But of course, in a warm climate or in a comfortable place, Munkacharov says he takes people to task like he often did and often does in his Sfarim. He writes very clearly that if a person is living comfortably and throughout the year in the winter they have a backyard patio and they have their fireplace and their furnace and their pit fire, and then they're not going to sleep in the sukkah, leil sukkah, so that is the stira minhagei. On the other hand, if a person has the ability to build a sukkah where there is the possibility for husband and wife to sleep together, then matov manoim. But here, really, what the Ramah is trying to express, the Taz writes this, Magen Avram writes this, Mat Ephraim writes this, other Gdolei Chronim indicate this as well, that the Ramah is not saying don't sleep in the sukkah. But we have a problem that people are not sleeping in the sukkah. So why are they not sleeping in the sukkah? Therefore, the Ramah suggests reasons as to why that's the case. Many Achronim have a very hard time with it, and they're not terribly satisfied with the reconciliations of the Ramah. But on a broader spectrum, a person really does have to appreciate and understand, specifically, when this tension does exist and when there is a clash between Halacha and Minhag, how the poskim addressed it is something very, very important to flesh out and to deal with. And this is really what the Tshuvas Sfarim are doing, what the Achronim are doing, trying to understand this dichotomy and this synergy between Halacha and Minhagim.
To the end of Sukkah, to Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah is really a day entirely of Minhag. If you can, if those aren't familiar, Abraham Yari has a book with Mosada of Kukul, told us Chag Simchas Torah, fabulous book, well worth reading, going through all the Minhagim of the whole day. Basically, the whole day is Minhag, everything we do. So, one thing that you discuss in the book is we lane V'Zos HaBerachah Simchas Torah night, and we never lane at night. So, what's the deal with that?
Yes, as you pointed out correctly, very important. Many people are also unfamiliar. Simchas Torah really is a yomtiv of minhag. There's no, of course, Sukkah in the Torah.
I just wanted to jump in. A lot of the things we accomplish, it's very late. Some it's a guy in it, but some of the things we do are very late.
Not just late, but this piggybacking on our last topic regarding sleeping the sukkah, there are many minhagim that we do that are opposite or are confrontational to halacha. For example, dancing and singing. We're not allowed to sing and dance. We can't dance on a Yom Tov. That the Ramah writes clearly. We don't dance. You never dance. So how could we dance? So the Rishonim write, the Ramah explains from Simchas Torah, as a result of the joy of the celebration of the conclusion of the Torah, we do that. We're not terribly makbid to have a son receive an aliyah after a father. We continuously repeat the parsha over and over again. There are so many things that we do differently vis-a-vis Hilchos Kriyas Torah and Simchas Torah, as opposed to what we do during the year. So here again, you see this tension and this distinction between Halacha and Minhag, and of course, all of the Achronim try to explain how could we do this. An example, as you pointed out specifically, laning at night. When do we ever do that? This is the Manishtan Alayla Zemikol Alaylos. How could it be that we're laning Leil Simchas Torah? We never do such a thing. The truth is that this is an example, I think, an anomaly on a certain level where the Vilna Gaon himself supported the practice, so much so that the Vilna Gaon has even received an Aliyah Leil Simchas Torah, and according to some reports, even received the first Aliyah. He wasn't the Kohen, but he received the Aliyah of Kohen particularly, and therefore it leads to a lot of confusion what should be laned and why we land. And much of it is based upon a very cryptic comment to the Ramah, when the Ramah writes that Leil Simchas Torah, we lane Kol Nidrei. What's Kol Nidrei? So this leads to a big, big debate in the Achronim. What does it mean and what should we lane Simchas Torah night? And there are those who suggest that we actually lane Parshas Nedarim, Parshas Matos, which is very difficult to understand. Others explain that Nedarim means there were certain parashios throughout the course of the year that were auctioned off for a significant amount of money, including Matova Alecha Yaakov, Shema Yisrael, Torah Tziva, the major famous psukim that we read in the Torah, and those were auctioned off during the year, and therefore Leil Simchas Torah, we would lay in those particular parshios as a joyous way to conclude the Torah. Even later than that, became the custom to lay in Parshas V'Zos HaBerachah, and that's the latest minhag and the most difficult minhag to source. And much of it revolves around what the Ramah means in this very cryptic comment that we lay in Parshas Kol Nidrei. So among many, many confusing and difficult to source Minhagei Simchas Torah, this is one of them. And the truth is not everybody picked up on this minhag. And it's clear even in the Ramah that there were places that did and that didn't. And of course, you're not going to find in the early Rishonim that addressed this minhag, and it's a much, much later minhag. And therefore, this is what led to significant disparity between different communities as to whether or not one should or should not lane Simchas Torah, and when one does lane Simchas Torah, what exactly should be laned. And this is all machmas, as the Ramah writes, Simchas Torah. The joy of completing the Torah led to this custom, but again, there's significant opposition to this custom. Not everybody picked up upon it. The Bikur Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Endlinger, very important running commentary in Hilchos Sukkah, discusses this at great length, and he also talks about whether or not a bracha should be made on the laning. If you take a look in this chapter, fascinating chapter that's addressing all of the parameters, discussions, the source, the history, the opposition to this minhag. But there's no question in Ashkenaz, I believe it's almost common and unanimous today. You're not going to find a shul, I don't think, on any of the 7 continents, at least in the world of Ashkenaz, where that doesn't happen, and we just take it for granted. That's what you do. But the people who are interested and are curious will follow the fascinating historical debate that existed for several hundred years as to whether one should or should not lane.
Yeah, it's really, I've never been in a shul that doesn't, and as I said, Simchas Torah, really make a whole podcast on Simchas Torah, and maybe one day I will. It's fascinating, the subject. Read the book. Yari's book is fabulous, well worth reading, and Simchas Torah is, again, a whole day of Minhagim. And of course, with this podcast, I think I said this earlier, and if I didn't, we're only touching on some minhagim, and even then, we're only discussing a little bit. Really, there's so many more minhagim to discuss, so much more to say about the minhagim we spoke about. This is just to focus a little bit on some of the minhagim. One final minhag that's worth discussing, and so this is a good portion of your book that we've discussed. There's more in the book on other Yomim Tovim that, maybe Mitzvah for other Yomim Tovim will come back to another episode. But as it pertains to this episode and, Minhagei Yomim Nora'im, something that is to all Yomim Tovim is, as you say, a real highlight, and it is B'chas Kahanim, that in Chutz L'Aretz we don't have it on all the time as in Eretz Yisrael. But that's something, on Yom Tiv, it became the minhag that we do have it.
Yeah, this is, again, we could spend an hour plus. And again, this is another good example of how this book developed. I was giving shiurim on this topic, and people were riveted by this. And the truth is, this is an old question already in the times of the Rishonim, because the pasuk tells us clearly that duchening is something that seemingly should happen on a daily basis, and that's clear in all the major halachic codifiers, including the Rambam, the Torah, the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, etc. That's something that should take place on a daily basis, as it does in Eretz Yisrael. Somehow, some way, and again, I think our time is limited. You'll take a look in the chapter. In the times of the Rishonim in Chutz L'Aretz, that stopped. And there was no longer duchening taking place on a daily basis. And the Rishonim themselves are matmiya and ask the question, what happened? And here you have a fantastic example where something happened really without rabbinic sanction. The minhag developed to simply stop duchening. And here again, the Rishonim and the Ramah codifies in Hilchos Berachos Kohanim. What's the basis? How did this happen? Again, here's a tension between a din, a halacha, and a minhag. The Torah tells us the midrabanan, we know it to be true. The codifiers of Jewish law tell us you have to duchen. And now all of a sudden the minhag is that we don't duchen in Chutz L'Aretz. How could there be such a conflict? How could there be such a discrepancy? And seemingly we're doing something wrong. So the Maharil writes, and Beis Yosef quotes from other Gedolei Ashkenaz, that because the times are so difficult in Ashkenaz, and we are oppressed, we're depressed, we find ourselves threatened, whether it's the Crusades, the Inquisition, and pogroms and the like, duchening has to be done b'simcha, and since we're really not b'simcha, we can't duchen. We simply don't have the emotional equilibrium to duchen, and therefore it's an impossibility, and that's how the minhag developed, that we stop duchening. Minus Yom Tif, and not only Yom Tif, minus Musaf of Yom Tif, because even Shachris we're not so happy. But when you get to Musaf and you're about to go home and have a big Suda, then we're really happy. So that's when you could duchen. So that is one way, the classical way that the Ashkenazi Rishonim explain and reconcile why we don't duchen on a daily basis. We're simply not so happy. On Yom Tov, Musaf, we're happy. Another basic explanation, and this is also penned and codified by the Beis Yosef, and this is what the Ramah writes in Hilchos Berachos Kohanim, as the Ashkenazi Rishonim point out, is that it's very difficult and cold in Ashkenaz, and the Kohen has to be tovel before he duchens, And therefore the difficulty, the tircha, the struggle to go in and out of a mikvah in the cold European mornings is something that we can't expect the Kohen to do, and therefore we were mevatel berchas kohanim. Now, of course, what seems to be most problematic about it, and that's what the Ashkenaz and the Beis Yosef himself addresses, who says that you have to go to the mikvah before you duchen? And is that a reason to be mevatel a mitzvah aseh d'oraisa? So therefore, the question in this context is stronger than the answer. And the fact that the minhag Ashkenaz is not to duchen in Chutz L'Aretz leaves us in a great, great quandary. Many Gedolei Achorim, the Tshuvas Sfarim, suggest many other reasons. And I will point out, if your listeners are familiar or unfamiliar, the great Vilna Gaon and his Talmud Rechaim Volozhiner attempted to reinstitute and to reestablish duchening in Volozhin and in Vilna. And of course, as the story goes and as it's anecdotally written, and the Talmidei Agra put this, and as you'll see in my sefer, there is very, very significant source material for this. The night before the Vilna Gaon was prepared to establish duchening in Vilna, he was jailed as a result of some libel that was placed against him, and the Gra took that as a siman min hashemayim that he shouldn't duchen and shouldn't reestablish duchening. Same thing happened in Volozhin. The night before Chaim Volozhin instituted and announced that the shuls should begin to duchen again. A major fire broke out in Volozhin, included burning down the major shul in Volozhin, and again, Chaim Volozhin took that as a siman min hashemayim that duchening is not something that should happen in Ashkenaz, and therefore that's the story. That's the reason, the basis. The famous Rabbi of the Chassam Sofer, B'Nosson Adler, did indeed successfully institute the duchening again. The Chassam Sofer decided that there wasn't something that he should do and didn't do it. But much, much discussion amongst the Gedolei Ashkenaz and the Achronim of Ashkenaz and the Rishonim of Ashkenaz that it seems to be that this minhag is troubling and is complicated. But the fact that for upwards of 800, 900 years, this is what the Rishonim said and did, and the fact that the Gra and the Chassam Sofer and Chaim Volozhin attempted and did not reinstitute it, therefore is not done. But if you travel to your neighboring city called Deal, you will see that every Sephardi shul in Deal does duchen on a daily basis. Sephardim duchen on a daily basis. It's the Ashkenazim that are left with a very significant question. Again, it's not our question, it's the question that the Rishonim ask. And again, a fascinating dichotomy and distinction, really, and a tension, a tug of war that exists between Halacha and Minhag. What should be done, what's supposed to be done, what is it mitzvah d'oraisa, and why we don't
about
do
duchening
it.
Berachas Kahanim, my friend Naftali Warburger just recently published actually a full book on this, The Priceless Treasure of Berachas Kahanim, History, Halachas, Minhagim, and Stories with Art Scrolls. So if anyone wants to read up specifically on Berachas Kahanim in English, you just mamish brand new. So there's much more, really about everything. There's more to talk about, more minhagim, more to go in depth about these minhagim, but just a taste of a little bit here for Yomim Nora'im. So thank you for joining me to discuss this. But as just to wrap up, I don't know if you wanted to mention the other minhagim that you talk about in this book, and also your other two books. I mentioned them in the beginning, the making of a halachic decision and the making of a mensch, if you want to mention what those are about. And also for the listener, all these books are Feldheim. They're available in your local Sfarim store. They're available on a Feldheim's website. I'll put a link in the show's notes for anyone interested who can purchase them. But if you would just, Rabbi Walter, just want to mention what the other books are.
Sort of with is, I hope I've whet people's appetite in writing and orally through shiurim and through the writing to appreciate the sugya of minhagim. It's a parak in Shas, it's Mishnayos, it's Gemara, it's Rishonim, and it really, on a certain extent, defines us. So much so, the halacha is that when you're tovel a ger, besides requiring the ger to commit to the Deraisas and the Rabbanans, there's a third side to the triangle, and that's minhagim. Minhagim play a very significant role in who we are as a people. Many times we see that people chip away at minhagim, laugh or mock at minhagim. You hear people say it's only a minhag, and therefore one has to understand minhagim, what minhagim are, what does it mean minhag Yisrael Torah. Of course, we've touched only on a drop in the bucket of what minhagim are and how minhagim work, and the tension between minhag and halacha, and how to accept and understand the teeth of minhagim, when minhagim are binding, when minhagim are not binding, and the like. And this, to a certain extent, is piggybacking on my first book, The Making of a Halachic Decision, where, again, the focus is to educate and to teach what is halacha, what's the halachic process, how does it work, how do we understand to deal with the machlokes in Rishonim, What is the Shulchan Aruch's position? Can you disagree with the Shulchan Aruch? What happens when the Ramah disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch? What happens when the Shach and the Smad disagree with the Ramah? What does it mean, Halacha kibasra? What's the method to the quote-unquote madness of halacha, and how does the halachic system work? How do poskim deal with halachic practice? Is there a system? Is there a curriculum? What's the basis, and how do we decide and decipher between something that's halacha and not halacha? These are the two halves of the coin, the making the minhag of the one and the making halachic decision the other. And I guess the other, making the mention, is where I really try to focus and appreciate that mitzvos ben adam l'chavero are equivalent to mitzvos ben adam l'makom, in the same rigor and the same significance and seriousness that the Rishonim took halacha ben adam l'makom, and the lumdus that exists and the halachic debate that exists in minhagei and halachas of ben adam l'makom also is true when it comes to ben adam l'chavero. People have to appreciate and know full well that when it comes to the losachmor, when it comes to a variety of different mitzvahs, the same mitzvahs losas, the ben adam l'chavero, those are very, very critical, just as important, especially now, before the Yomim Nora'im are coming to appreciate that the behavior that we have, ben adam l'chavero, certainly is equivalent to those of ben adam l'makom, and siyata d'shmaya. Hopefully we'll be able to fulfill that mission.
I'll post the books in the show's notes if anybody interested, or you can buy in your local farm store. And with that, thank you, Rabbi Walter, for joining me, and ksivach simatayv to everybody.
Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be with you. Asher Kayach.